Chapter 2. Henry VIII and Reform, 1509 to 1547. Death and Disorder. The Evil May Day Riot. Among the few legitimate occasions for disorder in otherwise orderly early modern England were the days of celebration associated with ancient pagan festivals, when commoners exercised some freedom of expression. During Saturnalia, for example, which occurred just before Christmas, the Greek god Saturn was figuratively released from the wool that bound his feet to the remainder of the year. When Saturn was liberated, workers were likewise freed from their obligations, and a local, quote, Lord of Misrule, end quote, was chosen to preside over a day of harmless revelry. The next day, with Saturn rebound, order was restored. Another occasion for revelry was May Day, a holiday celebration on May 1st to herald the arrival of spring and the beginning of the agricultural cycle. In the rural countryside, young virgin women were selected to dance around a maypole, symbolically representing fertility and the readiness of the earth to be implanted with seed. In the cities where agriculture was less important, May Day was more commonly associated with the celebration of the labor provided by the apprentices, journeymen, artisans, and merchants, and with appeals to justice, fairness, and redistribution of wealth among the rich and the poor. The myth of Robin Hood in this context was sometimes involved. Normally, May Day was another harmless event causing minor disorder, but the celebration of 1517 was anything but. It was triggered by an Easter sermon given by an Augustinian canon named Thomas Bell. In the sermon, Bell railed against the, quote, aliens and strangers, end quote, who lived in London, stole jobs from hard-working laborers and artisans, took business from English merchants, and became rich as Londoners became impoverished. There was also some suggestion that, quote, aliens, end quote, were seducing English wives and daughters, placing the future of English families and perhaps the purity of English blood in jeopardy. Bell called on all Englishmen, quote, not to suffer the said aliens so highly in their wealth, and the natural-born men of this region to come to confusion, end quote. Fueled by xenophobia, Bell's sermon was a call to action against the immigrants of London. Over the next few weeks, as May Day approached, apprentices and journeymen began distressing immigrants. Aliens were beaten and thrown into rivers and canals, and their property was damaged, actions that forced the mayor to commit several of the aggressors to gaol. Perceiving the city's government to be unduly affectionate towards immigrants, at some point it was decided that on May Day, quote, the city would rebel and slay all aliens, end quote, which caused many immigrants to flee out of fear. The Privy Council soon became involved, commanding the mayor and aldermen to enforce a curfew on May Day Eve. In defiance, starting around 9 in the evening, Londoners violently freed their fellow artisans from the galls, gathered weapons, and moved into immigrant parts of the city, such as the area north of St. Paul's Cathedral, where especially Dutch and French aliens lived. The rioters sacked homes, workshops, and businesses and threw the strangers' goods into the street. It did not take long to restore order, although the rioters had not killed anybody nor caused significant damage to person or property. A greatly exaggerated version of the events was sent to the king, who ordered the Duke of Norfolk and 1,300 troops into London to suppress the rioters. By 3 in the morning, most of the rioters either had been arrested or had returned to their homes. About 180 men, women, and boys were apprehended and sent to various galls awaiting their fate. The courts acted quickly. By May 2nd, 13 men were charged with treason against the king on the somewhat spurious grounds that the king was, at that time, at peace with the victims' home countries. The judges, the mayor of London, the Duke of Norfolk, and the Earls of Shrewsbury and Surrey found each of the accused guilty. The executions occurred at various gallows erected throughout London on May 4th. A couple of weeks later, the remainder of the rioters, including 11 women, stood before the king, his queen, Catherine of Aragon, Chief Minister Cardinal Thomas Wolsey, and several nobles, quote, the poor younglings and old false knaves, end quote, were joined together with lengths of rope wearing shirts with halters around their necks, all imminent signs of execution. As a group, the prisoners declared their guilt, admitted that they deserved to be hanged, and pled for mercy. In a highly orchestrated event, the nobles and Wolsey got on their knees and pleaded for a pardon, as did the Queen, who appealed on behalf of the prisoners' the prisoners' wives and children. The King announced the pardon and sent the accused home. For Henry VIII, this was a rare sign of mercy in a reign that saw the death of many other rebellious subjects. The evil May Day riot speaks to a number of key themes in Tudor England. The importance of order, limits on how much disorder was tolerated even during days of revelry, the intense insularity and xenophobia that characterized England at this time, and the Crown's swift and harsh treatment against perceived enemies of the realm. Discussion question 2.1. Why do you think the Tudor state executed more than a dozen people after the May Day riot, even though the riot itself had not resulted in any deaths? Thomas More and English humanism. Sir Thomas More was perhaps the greatest intellectual in the court of Henry VIII. More was one of the earliest beneficiaries of the, quote, new learning, end quote, associated with the adoption of Renaissance humanism in England during the late 15th century. Humanist education, the Studia Humanitatis, or study of the humanities, emphasized the importance of reading and writing the classical languages of Latin and Greek, and a curriculum that focused on liberal arts subjects such as ethics, rhetoric, logic, history, law, and religion, with particular emphasis on the writings of classical authors from Rome, Greece, and the early Christian Church. Humanists also disapproved of citizens leading a contemplative life, often characterized by monastic isolation, rather than an active life which required becoming involved in public affairs. To an extent, the adoption of humanist education and ideas in England represented a key transition from the medieval to the early modern worldview. At the age of 11, More left grammar school to join the household of Archbishop of Canterbury, John Morton, who also happened to be England's Lord Chancellor. More's intellect quickly came to the attention of Morton, who sent the youth to Oxford to further his studies. There, More came into contact with leading humanists of the day, including Thomas Linacre and William Grocyn, who taught More Latin and Greek. After 2 years, More entered Lincoln's Inn, one of Lincoln's 4 inns of court, to become a common law lawyer. But he still maintained close ties with the Oxford humanist and came into contact with Grocyn's friend Desiderius Erasmus, a Dutch Christian humanist who is often considered to have been England's leading scholar and theologian at the time. More's marriage in 1505 made it clear that his career track would be law, not the priesthood, as priests were not allowed to marry. While working as a lawyer, More produced translations and editions of classical and humanist works, sat as a member of Parliament, became a justice of the peace and under-sheriff, and wrote a biography of Richard III. In 1516, More produced his best-known work, Utopia, a quintessentially humanist rhetoric dialogue written in Latin that fictionally and satirically described More's and many humanists' desires for a world that was less corrupt and avaricious, more pious in religion, and fairer in law, especially regarding England's harsh treatment of criminals and its system of private property ownership that heavily favored the wealthy. Ultimately, the book was about encouraging active, virtuous citizens such as More to become involved in worldly affairs in order to limit noble excess, injustice, and potential royal misrule. Ironically, More was London's under-sheriff at the time of the evil May Day riot, where he implored the rioters to return peacefully to their homes. It was shortly after the writing of Utopia that More became a trusted advisor to Cardinal Thomas Wolsey, Lord Chancellor of England and a chief counselor to Henry VIII. More's training in law and religion made him a vital member of the King's Council. When the king decided to write a treatise criticizing Martin Luther, the Assertio Septem Sacramentorum, Defense of the Seven Sacraments, 1521, More was a leading advisor. When Luther wrote a vituperative response, More, as a key figure in the English Catholic humanist movement, penned the Responsio ad Lutherarum, Response to Luther, 1523. More was also heavily involved in suppressing English heretics who supported Lutheranism or any other form of church reform, particularly those who wanted to read a new English language Bible produced by William Tyndale. By 1529, More had written his masterful Dialogue Concerning Heresies, in which he defended the institutional nature and doctrinal correctness of the Roman Catholic Church and its theology. Despite his value to the English state, More would, as we shall see, suffer for these beliefs. The King and the Cardinal. Henry VIII was 17 years old when he ascended the English throne. Henry VIII was 17 years old when he ascended the English throne. Handsome, exceptionally tall for the time, 6'2", athletic, charming, and extroverted, Henry was an imposing figure. Like many elite boys of his generation, Henry had been trained to be a superior archer, horseman, swordsman, and huntsman. He had a profound love of showing off these skills during chivalric tournaments, which, owing largely to Henry's passions, achieved something of a rebirth during the 16th century. Contrary to how Henry VIII is often represented in modern times, Henry was also a gifted student blessed with a sharp intellect. Trained in the same humanist intellectual tradition as Sir Thomas More, and guided in his efforts by Erasmus and other leading humanists, Henry was well versed in philosophy, law, religion, and mathematics. He was both artistic and musical and composed and played songs in a variety of instruments. He was also skilled at language, especially Latin and French, the two most common languages of literature and diplomacy, but also Italian and Spanish. It was this wide-ranging humanist education that enabled Henry, with a little help from More, to pen his rebuttal to Lutheranism. Henry was, however, a young man who preferred pleasure to business and lacked the work ethic of his father. Whereas Henry VII was routinely involved in the day-to-day governance of the realm and devoted himself to being an effective administrator, his son was lazy, arrogant, and self-centered, acted impulsively on his desires with little thought to the consequences of his actions, and traveled extensively for pleasure with a massive body of servants and courtiers, paying the least possible attention to affairs of state. Also unlike his father, who had relied on experienced military leaders at Bosworth and otherwise preferred peace within Britain and Europe, Henry wanted to prove that he was a man capable of leading his kingdom in war. In particular, Henry wanted to recover losses from the 100 Years' War of 1337 to 1453, which saw England's claim to extensive French territories dwindled down to only the port of Calais, Calais. Finally, Henry quickly became overwhelmed by the sheer number of men who offered him counsel, in part because he lacked his father's decision-making skills and attention to detail. Only a couple of years into his reign, therefore, Henry required a chief executive officer, a principal minister, to run the English state, help manage his military campaigns, and relieve the king of the burdens of his office. The minister Henry turned to was Thomas Wolsey, the son of a butcher whose intellect, like More's, managed to get him into Oxford University. At the start of Henry's reign, Wolsey had been working as a royal almoner, a chaplain who distributed charity to the king's subjects. Henry quickly appreciated Wolsey's administrative skills and employed him to manage a military campaign into France from 1512 to 1514 in support of the Empire and Papacy. This campaign resulted in Henry personally leading an army into combat and winning the Battle of the Spurs. Wolsey had, in effect, turned his king into a legitimate military victor. This naturally raised Wolsey in the esteem of a king who prided himself on military prowess and had, up to that point, been demonstrated only through the sporting spectacles of his youth. Numerous honors, numerous honors soon followed for Wolsey. By 1514, Wolsey was Archbishop of York, and in 1515 he was elevated by the Pope to cardinal, the highest rank in the Roman Catholic Church. Wolsey was also granted several other church positions, including several bishoprics. Although Wolsey could not, of course, attend to all these clerical positions, a practice known as pluralism, and employed others to serve in his stead, he retained the revenues that they brought in, which soon made him the richest man in England besides the king himself. In total, his income has been estimated as greater than £30,000 per year, roughly 5 times that of the wealthiest nobleman, and 1/3 or so of the king's own income, which was used to run a royal court consisting of several palaces and hundreds of people. Wolsey was fond of conspicuously displaying his wealth, dressing in magnificence and building palaces in London, York Place, and Surrey, Hampton Court, both of which eclipsed the king's own palaces. Wolsey was a commanding presence in both domestic and foreign affairs. Henry made Wolsey Lord Chancellor in 1515, a position that put Wolsey at the head of the Royal Council and gave him the ability to use the Court of Chancery and the Court of Star Chamber against those who challenged his authority. He was immensely disliked by the nobility, who saw him as a usurper, and his access to coercive tribunals afforded him the opportunity to bring the great men of the realm into conformity. As Chancellor, Wolsey also had exclusive use of the Great Seal, which was necessary to issue most important documents of state and meant that virtually no government policy, from parliamentary legislation to treaties, could proceed without Wolsey's explicit knowledge and approval. Wolsey was also chiefly responsible for advising the king on appointments to key positions in the realm. Candidates for judgeships, university professorships, episcopal benches, and royal councillors, among many others, all depended on Wolsey to pass their name to the king, who invariably took his chancellor's advice. All these activities involved the collection of fees, further enriching the wealthy cardinal. In foreign matters, Wolsey proved somewhat less successful, in part because England's remoteness and smaller population meant that it was hardly a major player in European politics, especially when compared to juggernauts such as the United France that emerged from the 100 Years' War and the vast Holy Roman Empire. Nonetheless, he brokered a number of key deals for England that proved, at least in the short term, beneficial. The Treaty of London of 1518, for example, designed by Wolsey, was a non-aggression pact signed between France, England, the Empire, the Papal States, and Spain to come to the aid of any party who was attacked, especially if that attack came from another signatory, or, of greater concern at the time, the Ottoman Empire. Wolsey also engineered a meeting between Henry and Francis I of France, known as the Field of the Cloth of Gold, 1520, so named because both kings attempted to outdo each other's extravagance and had their clothing and tents made of silk sewn with gold thread. When the amiable relationship between England and France soured, Wolsey allied England with Emperor Charles V, a relationship that also soured when imperial forces sacked Rome in 1527 and took the Pope captive. Although Wolsey managed to make Europe aware of England's presence, Wolsey managed to make Europe aware of England's existence, his various diplomatic strategies on behalf of Henry VIII managed more than anything to drain the royal treasury that Henry VII had worked so hard to fill. Making war in Europe, even if it pleased a bellicose king, was an expensive proposition. The shortcomings of royal revenue to pay for these enterprises forced Wolsey to rely on Parliament for taxes. When these funds still proved insufficient, Wolsey surveyed the country and used its data to levy, quote, forced loans, end quote, and, quote, benevolences, end quote, against landholders. This was an extension of Henry VII's fiscal feudalism, as these methods during wartime were historically valid, but they were naturally unpopular. It was possibly a cold and calculating move by the king that he could claim ignorance of Wolsey's revenue-gathering schemes. The King's Great Matter. Gotta get your water, you know. For nearly 15 years, from 1515 to 1529, Wolsey was the virtual ruler of the realm, or at least that was the impression held by contemporaries and promoted by the king. But there was one thing that even the great cardinal could not accomplish, securing an annulment for Henry VIII from his wife, Catherine of Aragon. By 1527, Catherine was in her mid-40s, and though healthy, was probably no longer fertile. She had provided Henry with a daughter, Mary, in 1516, but only 4 of her 7 pregnancies were brought to term, and none produced a male heir who lived more than a matter of weeks. Henry believed it was essential that the heir to the Tudor throne be a male, as the rule of a woman would subvert the great chain of being, and quite possibly place the new dynasty at risk of usurpation by a male claimant. Henry also accepted that his own fertility was not at issue. He had successfully fathered an illegitimate son, Henry Fitzroy, literally, quote, son of the king, end quote, with his mistress, Elizabeth Blount, in 1519. This son, however, could not inherit the throne by virtue of his bastardy. The only solution to Henry was remarriage to a younger woman who could provide him with a legitimate son. Although divorce, as the term is generally understood today, was illegal by canon law, it was not unusual, especially for wealthy families, to secure annulments, in essence a declaration from the church that the marriage had not been validly contracted and was therefore illegitimate. Gaining such a concession would have meant that Henry could remove Mary from the line of succession and was free to remarry. He had already set his sights on a young lady-in-waiting named Anne Boleyn, who had refused to become his mistress, but was quite content to become his new wife, should the opportunity arise. Henry also had a reasonably valid legal argument, perhaps presented to him by Wolsey. According to Leviticus 20:21, a man who had sexual relations with his brother's wife, as Catherine had been for a matter of months, would be childless, which it was easier to interpret meant incapable of producing a living male heir. In fact, because of this biblical injunction, Henry's marriage to Catherine had required a papal dispensation, which Henry and Wolsey would later argue the Pope did not have the authority to give, as it was a matter of divine rather than canon law. Catherine would later claim that she and Arthur had not consummated their marriage, which meant she was never technically his wife, although this argument had little effect. To handle the logistics of what should have been a fairly straightforward annulment, both of Henry's sisters had secured annulments before these events. Henry turned to Wolsey, his Lord Chancellor, leading churchman, and papal representative, a position which he was granted in 1518. There was, however, a pressing diplomatic problem. In 1527, imperial forces on behalf of Charles V sacked Rome and took the Pope, Clement VII, captive. Emperor Charles V, the Pope's jailer, also happened to be the nephew of Catherine of Aragon, and consequently disapproved of the annulment. So long as this situation continued, the Pope could not permit the usual procedure in a case such as this, which would have been to allow Wolsey to hear the case in England. Instead, to slow down the proceedings and appease the emperor, in 1528 the Pope sent his own representative, Cardinal Campeggio, to London to hear the case. Following his orders, Campeggio prevaricated and delayed the hearings until May 1529, at which point Catherine, who had plenty of time to prepare her case, made a powerful argument against the annulment, and as a royal personage, demanded the right to have the case heard by the Pope himself. Rather than a mere representative. Before that issue could be resolved, Campeggio ordered a stay in the proceedings, arguing that it was necessary for the court to follow the papal court calendar, which did not sit during the summer months. As the imperial forces continued to make gains in Italy, the Pope recalled the case of Rome, another delay tactic that would not, Henry had become convinced, result in an annulment from Catherine. Campeggio's departure also signaled the end of Wolsey. He had failed to accomplish the one thing that as cardinal and legate should have been an easy victory, and pressure from the Boleyn faction, plus immense pressure from Wolsey's detractors, began breaking down the king's support of his principal minister. The final straw came when Wolsey advised Henry not to ally with France against the empire, which Henry saw as the only sure way to secure his annulment. He allowed Wolsey to be charged at the Court of King's Bench with praemunire, a medieval statute that prevented foreign powers from interfering with the king's authority. With a new parliament summoned for November 1529, Wolsey became concerned that he would be convicted by attainder, the consequences of which would have been execution. Instead, he pleaded guilty to the praemunire charge and was dismissed as chancellor and stripped of all other offices except the archdiocese of York. Hampton Court was seized and became Henry's main residence for the remainder of his reign. Wolsey traveled to Cawood Castle, near York, but evidence that he was negotiating with agents in Europe soon brought a charge of treason. On his way back to London to answer the charge, Wolsey fell ill and died, saving himself from the indignity of beheading that would have been the probable outcome otherwise. The Reformation Parliament. Wolsey's failure to secure the king's annulment and developments in European politics had, by 1529, convinced Henry VIII that if he was to secure his divorce, it would take more aggressive, non-conventional measures. It is in these measures that we see the beginnings of the Reformation of the English Church. Wolsey's replacement as Chancellor was Thomas More, who, for several reasons, preferred not to get involved in the divorce proceedings. Henry instead relied on the advice of another protege of Wolsey's, Thomas Cromwell, who, like More, came from humble beginnings to make his name in law, serving as a member of Parliament and counselor to the king. In both capacities, Cromwell became a leader of parliamentary religious reform. Henry called Parliament his first in 5 years in November 1529, with the intention that it help resolve various financial issues, but also that it address abuses allegedly committed by the English clergy. For good reason, this Parliament, which sat intermittently for 7 years, is known as the, quote, Reformation Parliament, end quote. In the early stages of reform, there were no plans to break with Rome, nor except for a vocal few, such as Simon Fish in his Supplication for the Beggars, 1530, a move toward a, quote, heretical, end quote, religion such as Lutheranism. But there were plenty of concerns about the clergy that could be addressed. As seen in the example of Wolsey, many clergymen were pluralists, serving multiple dioceses and parishes, which also caused absenteeism, because a priest holding multiple positions could only be in one place at a time. There were also criticisms about the number of priests and nuns in monastic orders, who cloistered themselves off from society. Together, pluralism, absenteeism, and monasticism made some members of the clergy immensely wealthy, while also ensuring that many priests did not actively minister to the English people. It was argued that priests also charged excessive fees for their services in probating wills, arranging funerals, and exacting fines in ecclesiastical courts. The Latin Mass and absence of an English-language Bible also meant that few commoners could actively participate in their religion. There was also the fact that the entire priesthood was in Henry's mind guilty of prémunire. By listening to the orders of Cardinal Wolsey and the Church in Rome, and by paying annates, the first year's revenue of a new ecclesiastical position, to the Pope, Henry charged the entire English clergy with prémunire and only pardoned them when they submitted to his authority and paid a substantial fine. In their submission of 1532, the clergy, through its legislative body known as Convocation, also acknowledged that Henry was, quote, singular protector only and supreme lord, and as far as the law of Christ allows, even supreme head, end quote. This submission provided Cromwell with the ability to push a flurry of legislation through Parliament, signaling something of a change in Parliament's historical practices by legislating matters relating to religion that would become an issue in later decades. Henry and Cromwell were helped in their efforts by the death in 1532 of Archbishop of Canterbury, William Warham. This allowed Henry to place the acquiescent Thomas Cranmer, who was more favorable to the annulment, into the position of being the highest prelate in the realm. To ensure that Cranmer had the unfettered power to hear the annulment case, Cromwell had Parliament pass the Act in Restraint of Appeals. This act declared that, quote, this realm of England is an empire governed by one supreme head and king having the dignity and royal estate of the imperial crown, end quote. In essence, Henry claimed, quote, imperial, end quote, absolute authority to give his realm without deference to any other being except God. Convocation duly submitted to this authority, prompting More to resign the chancellorship, ostensibly because of his health, but clearly in protest. More was humanist enough to seek reform of clerical abuses and other deficiencies of the Church, but he could not so easily throw off the authority of the Roman Catholic Church in England and accept his king as its head. Although Cromwell did not step into the chancellorship, he indisputably became Henry's principal minister. The passage of the Act of Restraint of Appeals had the immediate effect of denying Catherine the ability to appeal her case to Rome, as she had attempted during the Campeggio hearing. This meant that Cranmer now had the authority to hear the case and issue the annulment that Henry and the Boleyn faction had sought for nearly 6 years. Cranmer promptly assembled a tribunal that declared the marriage illegitimate. This was just in time, as Cranmer had already secretly married Henry and Anne in January 1533, and by the time Anne was crowned queen, she was already 6 or 7 months pregnant. Unfortunately for Henry, the child born in September was a girl, Elizabeth Tudor, but Anne was young, healthy, and obviously fertile, so although Henry was initially despondent, he had every reason to believe that she would bear him a healthy boy to inherit the crown. As we shall see, this did not turn out to be true. 4 parliamentary acts followed in 1534, those of succession, supremacy, treason, and annates. These acts declared Mary illegitimate, placed the succession into the children born of Anne, made the king the supreme head of the English Church, made it an act of treason to deny these facts, and abolished the payment of annates to Rome. The supremacy in particular was quite radical for the time. The idea that the Pope was not the head of the Church and that the Church was instead headed by the king, a secular authority, was not one that everybody could accept. The requirement for all clergy, professionals, gentlemen, and nobles to swear oaths that acknowledged the succession and supremacy was a bitter pill for many to swallow. Most did swear the oaths out of fear for their lives, offices, titles, and lands, because they held a genuine belief that the church needed reform, or because they did not much care who headed the church. The clergy, of course, had already acknowledged Henry's superior position 2 years earlier. Thomas More refused to swear to the supremacy and the succession, which enabled his enemies to charge him under the Treason Act. He was tried before a panel of judges that included Anne's father, brother, and uncle in July 1535, although More elected not to respond to certain questions, hoping that his silence would not be viewed as an explicit denial of the supremacy. Cromwell produced a witness, Solicitor General Richard Rich, who claimed he had personally heard More deny that the king was the supreme head of the church. Given the composition of the tribunal, this was sufficient evidence to secure a conviction. More was sentenced to be hanged, drawn, and quartered, a common method of capital punishment used for traitors. But in deference to his former offices, the sentence was commuted to beheading, a swifter and more dignified death normally reserved for members of the nobility. More's head was placed on a pike over London Bridge as a warning to other would-be traitors. By the end of Henry's reign, many others, mostly clerics decrying the supremacy from the pulpit, would follow him into martyrdom. A final act of 1536 extinguished any and all authority of the Pope in England from the momentous Reformation Parliament. A final act of 1536 extinguished any and all authority of the Pope in England from the momentous Reformation Parliament to an end. Discussion question 2.2. What purposes were served by the English Reformation occurring by acts of Parliament rather than being ordered by the king? The reforms of Cromwell and Cranmer. Although the Reformation Parliament had accomplished a great deal, the reform of the church was not yet over. Cromwell was named to the new position of vicegerent in ecclesiastical matters, in effect becoming the king's deputy head of the church. With Cranmer, Cromwell supported the printing in 1536 of the 10 Articles, which contained both Lutheran and Catholic elements. For example, the Articles accepted the Catholic doctrine of transubstantiation, whereby the bread and wine consumed at the altar during the Eucharist take on the, quote, whole substance, end quote, of Christ's body and blood, while the outward appearance remained unaltered. Lutherans, by contrast, explicitly rejected transubstantiation, arguing that the bread and wine commingled with Christ's body and blood, and in what was known as the, quote, sacramental union, end quote. As soon as I start recording, the allergies come out. Let me blow my nose real quick. But the Articles also accepted the necessity of only 3 sacraments, the Eucharist, baptism, and penance, confession, without mention of the other 4 sacraments required by the Catholic Church, confirmation, last rites, holy orders, and matrimony, which in Lutheranism were considered rites that were not necessary for salvation. Taking another Lutheran stance, the Articles accepted that images and statues of saints were symbolic for remembrance, but that they should not in and of themselves be venerated as objects of worship. Finally, the Articles claimed that prayers for the dead were useful to speed their time in purgatory, but that papal pardon had no utility. This was a position that reflected Luther's attack against granting of indulgences, which England adopted because of its anti-papal position. Using the 10 Articles as his marching orders for reform, but in fact going well above their mandate, Cromwell issued a series of injunctions enforced by several traveling commissions and visitations in which he initiated a number of ecclesiastical reforms. These included the introduction of the, quote, Great Bible, end quote, in 1539, an English-language version written by Miles Coverdale, and instructions that ordered parents and masters to teach their subordinates the Lord's Prayer and the Ten Commandments. In essence, Cromwell's reforms could be seen to have placed the interpretation of Scripture into the hands of laypeople, a Lutheran idea that was not preferred by Catholics. Books and treaties were too, quote, popish, end quote, were outright destroyed. Books and treaties that were Sorry, I'm fucking up here. In essence, Cromwell's reforms could be seen to have placed the interpretation of Scripture into the hands of lay people, a Lutheran idea that was not preferred by Catholics. Books and treatises that were too, quote, popish, end quote, were outright destroyed. This action had devastating effects on the university libraries, which were populated primarily by Orthodox religious texts. Several sets of injunctions and visitations by commissioners occurred over the next few years, during which there were various outbreaks of iconoclasm. Images, icons, statues, shrines, and relics, especially those that smacked of popery and idolatry, were removed from churches and sometimes destroyed. The issuance in 1537 of the Institution of a Christian Man, better known as the Bishop's Book, supported a number of these initiatives while also better explaining the role of the four sacraments left out of the 10 Articles. Perhaps the most significant of Cromwell's reforms as vicegerent involved the dissolution of the monasteries beginning in 1536. As noted, one of the grievances against the clergy was their tendency to cloister themselves off from the world. By the mid-1530s, there were nearly 900 religious houses in England, including monasteries, convents, and friaries, housing about 12,000 men and women who did not provide religious services to lay people. One of the chief critics of monasticism was Erasmus. He argued that members of religious houses were lazy and self-centered, contributed little to the spiritual needs of the laity, and lived in shrines that contained idols and relics that were either false or deserved to be seen by ordinary people. All these concerns were confirmed and probably somewhat exaggerated by Cromwell's servants who visited the monasteries and other religious houses. Because monasticism often involved the copying out of canonical Catholic texts, it was also believed to be a chief cause of the older brand of education, scholasticism, which was being increasingly challenged by the new form, humanism. Moreover, these institutions sat on about 15% of the land in England, land that brought in a tremendous fortune for the cloistered clergy but was not taxed in the usual manner, nor was enough of it used to distribute as charitable alms. In dissolving the monasteries, therefore, Henry could send the clergy out among the people, while at the same time claiming all their considerable property and land as part of the crown's possessions. Another significant impact of the dissolution was the removal of the abbots from the House of Lords, which reduced the spiritual lords to about 25, and importantly, for the reforms yet to come ensured that the temporal peerage had numerical supremacy in that body. Those monastic houses that were allowed to remain were required to pay substantial fines to the crown in exchange for exemption from dissolution. Cromwell even created a new government body, the Court of Augmentations, to administer the financial windfall that roughly doubled Henry's royal revenues and enabled him for a time to live the life due a great Renaissance prince in a now enlarged Hampton Court Palace, which became a prime symbol of a wealthy and powerful Renaissance monarchy. By the end of his reign, however, Henry had been forced to sell a large portion of monastic lands to pay for wars and campaigns with the result that he ultimately died in debt. Reactions to reform. These changes to religion caused some reaction among the English populace, though not as much as one might expect. From a doctrinal and ceremonial perspective, few ordinary people in England would have noticed much difference in their religious observance, and most would not have much cared that the king, rather than the pope, was now the head of their church. Besides, the key changes, reducing clerical abuses, limiting the gluttonous and avaricious lives of senior clergy, as exemplified by Wolsey's lifestyle, and introducing vernacular texts were forms that most lay people would have seen as practical and necessary. Bursts of iconoclasm were surely noticed, but these efforts at reform did not, as we shall see, last very long. Indeed, reform in the Church had been ongoing, on a slow evolutionary basis, for more than a century. Although the Reformation under Henry was decidedly an act of state, carried out by the king, his councillors, and Parliament, rather than a groundswell popular movement that developed from widespread discontent over the Church, the common people were also not so fervently faithful that they could not accept change and compromise, especially in areas of worship that did not jeopardize their salvation. The major exception to the otherwise muted reaction to religious reform came in the form of an uprising known as the Pilgrimage of Grace. By the end of 1536, the reform-minded 10 Articles had recently been published, and the monasteries were being dissolved and their property claimed by the crown. Discontent fomented in the northern parts of England. The participants in the uprising, led by a country gentleman named Robert Aske, wore badges depicting the 5 wounds of Christ and produced a list of grievances known as the Pontefract Articles. The articles listed 24 demands made by the pilgrims, including restoration of the Pope, the legitimization of Princess Mary, the return of the monasteries and their property, and the impeachment of Cromwell. All of these would suggest that the pilgrims had serious concerns about the religious reforms that had taken place in 1531. In fact, however, the majority of the articles cited demands that had nothing to do with religion, such as bringing about changes in how members of Parliament were elected, and grievances about new methods of taxation, and the ongoing process of enclosing common lands, which negatively affected the gentry and yeomanry. Despite the pilgrims' ostensible purpose of reversing religious reforms, the Pilgrimage of Grace was mostly an indictment of the many Tudor policies that managed over the past half-century to centralize royal authority, increase crown revenue streams, and limit provincialism that had been especially strong in the remote northern part of the kingdom. Although the king's representative, the Duke of Norfolk, failed to suppress the uprising in 1536, another series of outbreaks in the spring of 1537 was decisively handled by the king and resulted in the execution of Aske and nearly 200 other rebels. Despite the secularized concerns of the pilgrimage, it did encourage Henry to reflect on the changes to religion that Cromwell and Cranmer had brought about. At Henry's direction, Parliament issued the 6 Articles, 1539, otherwise known as an Act abolishing diversity in opinions, to reverse some of the more evangelical elements, and affirm that England, though without a pope, was still Catholic. Henry was, after all, the principal author of Defense of the 7 Sacraments, which had earned him the title of Fidei Defensor, Defender of the Earth, from Leo X, a title still used in the English monarch's full styling to the present day. The fact that the 6 Articles was issued not as a statement of faith so much as a penal statute threatening felony punishment for those who refused its directions shows that the king was serious about both about restoring traditional Catholicism and about impeding subsequent reform. In the ensuing years, a number of Protestant reformers, such as Anne Askew, were burned at the stake for heresy because of this statute. See Voices of the Past, Execution of Anne Askew. The 6 Articles together with the King's Book of 1543, a highly revised version of the Bishop's Book, serves as a reminder that Cromwell, ultimately to his detriment, leaned more toward doctrinal reformation than the king and court had ever intended. Excuse me, I know that's disgusting. Allergies are out, The brand of religion in England after 1536, therefore, was what might be referred to as, quote, Henrician Catholicism, end quote, because whatever efforts certain people took to move the nation toward Protestantism in the ensuing decade were thwarted by a king who was decidedly of the old faith, even if he had thrown off the yoke of Rome. It is possible that Henry was merely being cautious, and that his effort to retain Catholicism was more about appeasing the powerful conservative nobility and certain foreign powers, such as the emperor, than about his personal religious beliefs. Some evidence that he was involved in early drafts of the 10 Articles lends support to that argument, but Henry was also a monarch used to getting his way. Had he truly wanted reform, he very likely would have worked hard to achieve it and dealt decisively with those who challenged his authority, so it seems most likely that he was, after all, of a Catholic mindset. Whatever the case, especially after 1538, Henry refused to allow Lutheran reforms to enter England, even though he later considered a military alliance with the Lutheran princes of Germany. The fall and legacy of Cromwell. By 1536, Henry VIII was 45 years old, the age at which, by the standards of the early modern periods, adults enter their elder years. Henry also appeared older than he was. He had by then taken on the physical characteristics that today have come to be most associated with him: morbid obesity and serious gout because of extravagant living, such that he sometimes had to be carried about on a litter. Most seriously for the aging monarch, Henry still did not have a legitimate son to inherit his throne. Queen Anne had miscarried a boy in January of that year, and at 35 years old her chances of producing a live male heir were decreasing. Anne had also developed some enemies at court, not least of whom was Cromwell, who, at Anne's instruction, had been recently attacked in a sermon given by the Queen's chaplain because of his approach to dissolving the monasteries. At Henry's instigation, Cromwell undertook an investigation of Anne that soon led to a charge of adultery. Although adultery was not a particular seriously Although adultery was not a particularly serious crime and was not unusual among the upper ranks of English society, Anne and her alleged lovers were charged with treason because of the threat to the realm if Anne had become pregnant with another man's son. Using strong interrogation methods, Cromwell managed to get one of Anne's court musicians, Mark Smeaton, to confess to an illicit affair with the Queen. Within days, several other courtiers were rounded up and interrogated, including Anne's own brother, George, Viscount Rochford. After a brief trial, Anne, her brother, and 4 others were beheaded at the Tower of London in May 1536. Henry's marriage to Anne was declared invalid, and Princess Elizabeth was bastardized. "11 days after the execution, Henry wed his current infatuate, Jane Seymour, who had been one of Anne's ladies-in-waiting. The marriage was short-lived. Jane gave birth, much to Henry's delight, to a son, Edward, in October 1537, but he died from complications associated with the birth of a few days later. With an heir to the throne firmly and finally established, Cromwell saw the opportunity for a political marriage and arranged for Henry to court Anne of Cleves. Anne was the sister of a powerful German duke who thought himself Catholic, was entering the entertaining the idea of joining a league of Lutheran princes to protect himself against the Pope. Who had recently excommunicated Henry, and emperor. Cromwell dispatched Hans Holbein, England's most famous portrait painter, to travel to Germany and return with a painting of Anne. On the basis of the painting, which was evidently too flattering, Henry agreed to marry Anne, but upon seeing her in person in Rochester in 1540, the king was repulsed. He went through with the marriage because it was already contracted, and because the success of a foreign treaty depended on it, but Cromwell was now in the line of fire. The association of the marriage and treaty with Lutheranism, plus Cromwell's affecting broader religious reform than Henry was comfortable with, and the efforts of his many enemies at court ultimately led to his arrest for treason and executed in the Tower in July. As was common of traitors, his head was placed on a pike on London Bridge. Cromwell's execution brought an unfortunate end to a man who, according to a historian G.R. Elton, engineered a, quote, revolution in government, end quote, in the 1530s. Although most historians today see Cromwell's contributions as less revolutionary than they appeared to Elton, nonetheless under Cromwell's leadership, the English state did become more bureaucratic and professional, and began exhibiting modern characteristics. For example, the administration of the Erastian, state-run church, and the increased royal revenues from crown lands required more rigorous national infrastructure. In addition, Henry's council became a smaller and more private body of office holders rather like a modern ministerial cabinet. Cromwell also tightened the relationship between the central government and the provinces by appointing hundreds of local office holders who owed allegiance to the crown, and further reduced the ability of nobles to retain affinities. However, many of these reforms were initiated under the Yorkists and especially under Henry VII, making them evolutionary rather than revolutionary developments. Furthermore, the degree to which Cromwell himself was involved in these changes, and how deliberate he was in introducing them are still questions engaged by historians. Cromwell was also instrumental in ensuring that the authority of Tudor kings reasserted under Henry VII remained supreme. A good illustration of this is the passage in 1539 of the Parliamentary Statute, known formally as the Proclamation by the Crown Act and informally as the Lex Regia, Law of the Crown. Although the king had always had the power to issue proclamations on various subjects, normally this reflected prerogative powers of the king that were outside of parliamentary jurisdiction, such as the regulation of trade and the declaration of war and peace. Lex Regia, by contrast, allowed the king's proclamations, provided they were issued with the advice of his council and did not extend to the taking of life or property, to have the force of statute and be enforced by the government and courts as if they were passed by Parliament, in a continuation of the, quote, abuse, end quote, of Parliament that had begun when it was called to reform religion. This act furthered the process of what has been referred to as, quote, Tudor despotism, end quote. Although the act was repealed shortly after Henry's death in 1547, possibly because the new king was a child, it set the tone for the controversial nature of proclamations that would lead to crisis in the 17th century. In the few years before his death, Cromwell had also initiated policies that sought to bring unity to Britain and established Henry as an imperial monarch. In theory, the rulers of Ireland, Scotland, and Wales all owed allegiance and homage to the King of England, primarily as a result of various gains during the reign of Edward I. Their remoteness, combined with a century or more of weak kingship and strong provincialism, had resulted in limited English authority in these far-flung parts of the historical historical empire. Regarding Wales, Cromwell initiated a series of laws that abolished the, quote, Marcher lordships, end quote, borderland English authorities that governed Wales and united England and Wales together. English laws became operative in Wales, and Welsh subjects were given positions in the English Parliament to represent their constituencies. To administer Wales, Parliament passed an act that gave legislative recognition to a less formal body that had operated since 1472, the Council of Wales and the Marches. Following a series of uprisings, Cromwell and Henry decided in 1535 that Ireland would be governed by an English deputy, who maintained a well-equipped and expensive garrison in Dublin to limit further violence. Following Cromwell's execution, the deputy in Ireland helped to steer the issue of the religious supremacy through the Irish Parliament that had that body in 1541 recognize Henry as, quote, King of Ireland, end quote. Irish Gaelic chieftains were required to surrender their lands and titles to Henry, who would then regrant them using his regal authority. In Scotland, Henry's nephew, King James V, the son of Margaret Tudor and James IV, refused to break from Rome and accept Henry's supremacy. This refusal forced Henry to send an army into Scotland, where the Scots suffered defeat at the Battle of Solway Moss. James died shortly thereafter, leaving the throne to his 6-day-old daughter, Mary, Queen of Scots. Scotland was, until Mary came of age, ruled by regents who agreed in the Treaty of Greenwich, 1543, that Mary would, at the age of 10, wed Henry's heir, Edward, which would dynastically unite the realms. When Scotland repudiated the treaty, Henry sent his former brother-in-law, Edward Seymour, Earl of Hertford, to invade Scotland, a campaign known as the, quote, rough wooing, end quote. In sum, by the end of Henry's life, imperial authority, albeit in a fashion that still needed strengthening in subsequent decades, had been reasserted after 2 centuries of apathy. Discussion question 2.3. Henry VIII ultimately expressed regret for allowing Thomas Cromwell to be executed, yet he did little to prevent it. Why do you think this was the case? Coffee's gone. Succession, death, and legacy. In 1540, with the political situation in Europe altered and an alliance with the Lutheran princes no longer an issue, Henry swiftly secured an annulment from Anne of Cleves, a matter made easier by Henry's claim that the marriage was never consummated. Once again, he had fallen in love with a younger woman, this time Catherine Howard, niece of the powerful Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk. Henry and Catherine were married in July 1540. But this was yet another brief marriage. By spring 1541, Catherine began a romance with a courtier, Thomas Culpeper, which was revealed by Lady Rochford, the former sister-in-law to Anne Boleyn, and later by a letter found in Culpeper's private quarters. Catherine was imprisoned. Culpeper and another lover from before the marriage were identified and executed for high treason, the usual punishment for which was being hanged, drawn, and quartered. And Catherine was convicted by parliamentary attainder in January 1542. The 5th of Henry's wives was executed at the Tower the following month. Henry married for the last time in July 1543 to Catherine Parr, who managed to outlive him. A little older than 30 at the time of the marriage, Catherine was probably Henry's best match as wife. He was patient with her husband and served an effective regent while Henry was away fighting a costly war in France, and encouraged the king to reconcile with his daughters and return them to the line of succession. In 1544, another succession act declared Edward heir to the throne, which merely respected the historical precedent of male primogeniture, firstborn son, but made Mary and Elizabeth second and third in line. Henry presumably anticipated that Edward would grow into a man, marry, and have children of his own, making the succession of his daughters merely a matter of form. He could not have known that ultimately both of his daughters would take their turns as regnant queens of England. If all his children died without issue, the crown was to pass to the children of his sister, Mary, whose husband was Charles Brandon, Duke of Suffolk. Importantly, the succession conveniently passed over Henry's sister Margaret, even though she was older than Mary. Margaret's granddaughter, Mary Queen of Scots, was, therefore, silently removed from the line of succession, although ultimately her son would assume the English throne. By the end of 1546, it was clear that Henry was near death. In December, 1 month before he finally succumbed, he revised his last will and testament. It restated the restored order of succession, and because Edward was 9 years old, was a 9-year-old boy, established a regency council to rule England until the king came of age. The council consisted of 16 men, including Thomas Cranmer, and 2 chief justices of the law courts. The composition of the rest of the council was very unusual. It included 5 Catholics, several men were considered religiously neutral, and 6 men who were almost certainly Protestant, or at any rate of a humanist reformed disposition. This was an unexpected move for a king who several times between 1536 and 1543 took active steps to ensure that doctrinal reform was not introduced into the English Church. Perhaps Henry felt that reform was inevitable and wanted to place into power the men most likely to bring about a religion he could tolerate. Perhaps he perceived the noble Catholic families to be a greater threat to his son's minority than the reformed men he named to the council, or that his 2 greatest legacies as king, the royal supremacy of the church and emergence of the king as emperor within his own kingdom, would be reversed by a council that had the power to invite the return of the Pope. It is also possible that Henry saw the council as so perfectly balanced in terms of faith that they would maintain the status quo he had worked so hard to achieve. Henry VIII has often been described as the model Renaissance monarch. By the end of his reign, England had emerged as an imperial, centralized nation that had been run by secular authorities such as More and Cromwell. Its royal house was secure, celebrated the magnificence of divine right monarchy in palaces such as Hampton Court, and was wealthy and powerful enough to reward loyalty and punish enemies, both of which Henry did prodigiously. These characteristics combined to create what is often referred to as the rise of the early modern, quote, nation-state, end quote, a status also achieved at this time by, for example, France and Spain, as opposed to the disunity and provincialism that came to characterize Italy and the Holy Roman Empire by the late 16th century. Henry also displayed numerous characteristics that reflected Niccolo Machiavelli's ideal, quote, prince, end quote. He was intelligent, religious, gave the appearance of being merciful, and employed wise secular counselors. But he was also selfish, deceitful, militant, and ruthless to his enemies. He was, in short, both feared and loved, outwardly wise and kind, inwardly shrewd and plotting. It is possible that Henry was given a copy of Machiavelli's The Prince by Thomas Cromwell around the time of its first printing in 1532. Whether Henry saw himself reflected in Machiavelli's words, or actively sought to emulate them in the last 15 years of his reign, there is little doubt that Henry's style of rule would have pleased the Italian statesman. Discussion question 2.4. Can you think of reasons why Henry VIII chose a regency council to govern during his son's minority, rather than appoint a single Lord Protector as had happened in the past? Voices of the Past. The execution of Anne Askew. In the last decade of Henry's reign, England was divided between religious traditionalists who preferred Catholic rituals despite the break from Rome, and reformers who sought Lutheran-minded Protestantism. At the royal court, the traditionalists held sway because of political and diplomatic considerations, and began arresting and examining men and women who strongly advocated reform. One such reformer was Anne Askew, a poet who had become estranged from her husband because of her religious views. After her arrest in June 1546, Askew was tortured in the Tower, but she refused to recant her beliefs. She was then convicted of heresy and condemned to be burned at the stake, making Askew one of the first English women to be executed in the name of religious reform. The following extract describes Anne's torture and death. Touching the order of her racking in the Tower, thus it was. First she was led down into a dungeon where Sir Anthony Knevet, the lieutenant, commanded his gaoler to pinch her with the rack, which being done so much he thought sufficient. He went about to take her down, supposing he had done enough, but Thomas Wriothesley, the Lord Chancellor, not contented that she was loosed too soon, confessing nothing, commanded the lieutenant to stretch her on the rack again, which because he denied to do, tendering the weakness of the woman, he was threatened therefore grievously of the said Wriothesley, saying that he would signify his disobedience unto the king. And so consequently upon the same he and Sir John Baker, throwing off their gowns, would needs play the tormentors themselves, first asking her if she was with child, to whom she answered again, said, quote, "Ye shall not need to spare for that, but do your evils upon me," end quote. And so quietly and patiently praying unto the Lord, she abided their tyranny, till her bones and joints almost were plucked asunder, in short, as she was carried away in a chair. Now it remaineth that we touch somewhat as concerning her end and martyrdom. After that, she being born of such stock and kindred that she might have lived in great wealth and prosperity, if she would rather have followed the world than Christ, now had been so tormented that she could neither live long in so great distress, neither yet by her adversaries be suffered to die in secret. The day of her execution being appointed, she was brought into Smithfield in a chair, because she could not go on her feet by means of her great torments. When she was brought unto the stake, she was tied by the middle with a chain that held up her body. When all things were thus prepared to fire, Dr. Shaxton, who was then appointed to preach, began his sermon. Anne Askew, hearing and answering again unto him, where she said well, confirmed the same. Where she said amiss, quote, there, end quote, end quote. Where he said amiss, Jesus Christ. Where he said amiss, quote, there, end quote, said she, quote, he misseth and speaketh without the book, end quote. The sermon being finished, the martyrs, Anne, John Lascelles, John Adams, and Nicholas Belenian, standing there, tied at 3 several stakes, ready to enter their martyrdom, began their prayers. The multitude and concourse of people was exceeding, the place where they stood being railed about to keep out the press. Upon the bench under St. Bartholomew's Church sat Wriothesley, Chancellor of England, the old Duke of Norfolk, the Earl of Bedford, and the Lord Mayor, with divers others. Before the fire should be set upon them, one of the bench, hearing that they had gunpowder about them, and being armed, lest the faggots, bundles of sticks, by strength of the gunpowder, would come flying about their ears, began to be afraid. But the Earl of Bedford, declaring unto him how the gunpowder was not laid under the faggots, but only about their bodies, to rid them of their pain, which having vent, there was no danger to them of the faggots, so diminished that fear. Then Wriothesley, Lord Chancellor, sent to Anne Askew's letters, offering her the king's pardon if she would recant, who, refusing once to look upon them, made this answer again, that she came not hither to deny her lord and master. Then were the letters likewise offered unto the others, who in like manner, following the constancy of the woman, denied not only to receive them, but also to look upon them. Whereupon the Lord Mayor, commanding fire to be put unto them, cried with a loud voice, quote, Fiat justitia, let justice be done. And thus the good Anne Askew, with these blessed martyrs, being troubled so many manner of ways, and having passed through so many torments, having now ended the long course of their agonies, being compassed with flames of fire, as a blessed sacrifice unto God, she slept with the Lord A.D. 1546, leaving behind her a single example of Christian constancy for all men to follow. Source: John Fox, Acts and Monuments. Discussion question 2.5. Why was it important that the execution of Anne and the others be witnessed by a, quote, multitude, end quote, of people? Why were the condemned first offered the opportunity to recant?